In today's audiobook, we explore people-pleasing, not as a habit to break, not as a pattern to manage, but as a wound to understand, to grieve, and finally, to heal. This is the heart of you. We're never meant to shrink yourself. Published by Unchained Heart. In these pages, we go beyond the surface, inviting you to sit with what this theme truly means in your own life. Not the version of you that functions and smiles and apologizes before she even knows what she is apologizing for, but the version underneath, the one who is tired in a way that sleep does not fix. There is something I want to say to you before we begin, and I want to say it slowly, because it may be the first time you are hearing it in a way that actually lands. You did not become a people pleaser because you are weak. You did not become a people pleaser because you are overly emotional or too sensitive or lacking in backbone. You became a people pleaser because, at some point very early in your life, it was the most intelligent and necessary thing you could do to survive the emotional environment you were placed in. You learned with extraordinary precision how to read a room, how to sense a shift in someone's mood before they had even spoken, how to make yourself smaller, quieter, more agreeable, not because you wanted to disappear, but because disappearing felt safer than the alternative. And here you are now, years, perhaps decades later, still doing it, still shrinking before someone has even asked you to, still monitoring the faces of people around you with a vigilance so practiced it feels like breathing, still saying yes when everything inside you is screaming no, still choosing everyone else's comfort over your own truth, and calling it kindness, and calling it love, and telling yourself it is simply who you are. Perhaps you have noticed that there is a particular exhaustion that comes from this. Not the exhaustion of doing too much, though that is there too, but something deeper. The exhaustion of never quite being yourself. Of performing a version of yourself that other people find comfortable. Of living at a slight but constant remove from your own desires, your own voice, your own needs. It is the tiredness of a woman who has been traveling in the wrong direction for so long that she has almost forgotten there was a different direction she once wanted to go. Perhaps you have noticed, too, that something in you has started to resist. A quiet, stubborn, almost frightening resistance that rises up sometimes in the middle of an ordinary moment, washing dishes, driving to work, lying awake at 3 a.m, a voice that says, "This is not who I am. This is not all I am. I was not born to orbit other people's lives and never inhabit my own. That voice is why you are here. And that voice deserves to be heard." In Chapter 1, we will go to the beginning, to the place where the shrinking first started, to the family room or the schoolyard, or the relationship where you first learned that your authentic self was somehow too much, or not enough, or simply inconvenient. In Chapter 2, we will explore how that early learning shaped the identity you built, the good girl, the peacekeeper, the one who never causes problems, and what it costs to maintain her. In Chapter 3, we will sit with the patterns that people-pleasing created in your closest relationships, the invisible contracts, the resentments no one ever named, the loneliness of being surrounded by people who need you, and knowing, somehow, that none of them truly see you. In Chapter 4, we will turn to the body, because your body has been keeping score of every suppressed no, every swallowed feeling, every moment you smiled when you wanted to weep. In Chapter 5, we will begin the slow and sacred work of unchaining. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the quiet interior shifts that are the true beginning of freedom. And in Chapter 6, we will imagine, gently and without pressure, what life begins to feel like when you stop shrinking. When you take up the space you were always meant to occupy. This is not a book that will ask you to transform overnight. Eleanor does not believe in overnight transformations. She believes in the slow, honest, sometimes uncomfortable process of coming home to yourself, one small recognition at a time. If you find yourself wanting to carry this journey further, I invite you to follow the Unchained Heart channel. Every audiobook here is written for the woman who is quietly, privately trying to understand what happened to her and finding her way back. We would be honored to walk alongside you. Let us begin, gently, at the root of this. Chapter 1. The room where you learned to be small. Chapter 1. The room where you learned to be small. There is a room in your past, perhaps. Many rooms, where you first understood, not in words, but in the body, in the gut, in the chest, that it was not safe to be fully yourself. You may not remember the exact moment. It rarely arrives as a single dramatic event. It comes instead as an accumulation, 100 small moments that together taught you the same lesson, over and over, until it was written so deeply into your nervous system that you stopped being aware of learning it at all. It simply became the truth about how the world worked, about how you had to be in order to be safe, in order to be loved. For some, that room was the family dinner table. A father whose moods filled the entire house like weather, everyone watching him from the corner of their eye, everyone calibrating, everyone careful not to say the wrong thing, not to laugh too loudly, not to ask for too much. You learned to watch his face before you spoke. You learned to time your requests for the right moments. You learned that your needs were a burden unless they were presented in exactly the right way, at exactly the right time, with exactly the right tone. And so you became exquisitely skilled at reading him. At reading everyone. For others, that room held a mother who needed to be managed, not out of cruelty, but out of her own unhealed pain, her own wounds, her own emotional fragility that the child somehow felt responsible for containing. To make her sad was unbearable. To disappoint her was catastrophic. And so you learned to shape yourself around her feelings, to celebrate your own victories quietly so as not to make her feel inadequate, to suppress your own distress so as not to add to hers. You learned that love came with conditions, and the primary condition was, do not take up too much space. For others still, it was not the home but the schoolyard, the classroom, the early friendship group, where belonging felt desperately precarious, where you understood, with painful clarity, that being liked required being agreeable, that having opinions that differed from the group was dangerous, that the safest strategy was to mirror, to reflect, to adapt, to become whoever the people around you needed you to be. In each of these rooms, you were not failing. You were not being weak. You were being extraordinarily resourceful. The child who learns to read emotional environments with this level of precision, who learns to modulate her own presentation based on what others need, that child is intelligent. Deeply, subtly, emotionally intelligent. She is using every tool available to her to navigate an environment that is asking her to be less than she is. The tragedy is not in the learning. The tragedy is in what the learning costs. Because when you spend years training yourself to monitor others at the expense of monitoring yourself, when you practice daily the art of prioritizing everyone else's emotional comfort, you eventually lose fluency in your own interior life. You begin to struggle to know what you actually feel, what you actually want, what you actually need. You become so accustomed to asking, what does this person need from me right now? That the question, what do I need right now, starts to feel almost foreign, almost selfish, almost dangerous. There is a particular grief that comes with recognizing this. A grief for the version of yourself who never got to simply exist without earning her place. Who learned so early that she was too much or not enough, that she spent decades trying to find the precise calibration that would finally make her enough. The right amount of agreeable. The right amount of pleasant. The right amount of invisible. What would it mean to know, really know, in the body and not just the mind, that you were never meant to be calibrated? That you were never the problem those rooms made you feel you were? That the shrinking was a response to the environment, not a revelation about your worth? That question does not need an answer today. It needs to be felt. And the feeling of it, however unfamiliar, is the first thread of something beginning to loosen. This brings us gently to the next question. Not where the wound began, but what you built on top of it. What identity emerged from that original instruction to be small, and what it has quietly cost you to maintain her. Chapter 2. The woman you built to be loved. Chapter 2. The woman you built to be loved. At some point, and it happens so gradually that most women cannot identify exactly when, the strategies you developed to survive. Your early environment stopped being strategies and became a self. The careful, accommodating, endlessly giving, never imposing version of you stopped being a role you played and became who you believed you actually were. The good girl, the peacekeeper, the one everyone could count on. The one who never caused trouble, never asked for too much, never made anyone feel uncomfortable with her own inconvenient needs. She is not a fiction, this woman. She is real. She is kind and generous and deeply capable of love. The parts of her that give and care and show up are genuine. But she is also underneath the warmth and the capability and the easy smile, built on a foundation of fear. Not the kind of fear that announces itself. The quiet, chronic, low-grade fear of what happens when you stop performing, of what people will think when they discover that you have opinions that might not align with theirs, that you have needs, that you get tired, that you are not, in fact, endlessly available. This woman has a particular relationship with the word no. It is not simply that she finds it difficult to say, it is that the very thought of saying it activates something deep and old and physical in her. A contraction in the chest. A flash of guilt so swift it feels almost preemptive. Guilt before she has even refused, as though the refusal itself is already a crime. She has spent so long associating her own boundaries with conflict, and conflict with abandonment, and abandonment with the annihilation of love, that saying no feels not like a preference but like a threat to her survival. And so she says yes. She says yes to the extra work, to the difficult relative, to the friend who takes more than she gives, to the partner who has quietly learned that her limits are theoretical. She says yes, and then feels the resentment build, a resentment she immediately judges herself for, because she said yes, after all. No one forced her. What right does she have to resent? This is one of the cruelest features of the people-pleaser's inner life. The resentment is real and legitimate. It is the natural response to a self that is being perpetually suppressed. But because she said yes, she cannot allow herself to own the resentment, and so it turns inward, into tiredness, into a low and wordless sadness she cannot quite explain, into the feeling, on certain evenings, that she is watching her own life from a slight distance, as if she is a guest in it rather than its inhabitant. Perhaps you have noticed the particular way she speaks about herself, the self-deprecating qualifier before any statement of preference, the automatic downgrade of her own needs before anyone else has even questioned them. It doesn't matter. Whatever you want. I'm fine with anything, honestly. Don't worry about me. These are not just polite phrases. They are tiny daily acts of self-erasure, practiced so habitually they no longer register as choices. They register as personality. And here is what is perhaps most painful of all. The woman she built to be loved is often deeply loved. People do love her. They rely on her. They appreciate her. They turn to her in their difficult moments and find her there, always there, consistent and warm and uncomplaining. But she carries, under all of it, a quiet and devastating suspicion that what they love is her usefulness, her agreeableness, her willingness to remain small. And that if she were to become larger, if she were to have needs that were inconvenient, opinions that required negotiation, boundaries that demanded to be respected, the love would shift or disappear entirely. This suspicion may or may not be accurate. In some relationships, it is. In others, it is a ghost from an older room, haunting a present that has more capacity for her wholeness than she has yet allowed herself to test. But she rarely tests it, because the cost of being wrong feels too high. And so she remains contained, careful, perpetually smaller than she actually is. There is something important here that deserves its own space. The woman she built, the agreeable, giving, endlessly accommodating self, was not built in a vacuum. She was built in response to specific people, specific relationships, specific environments that made her original self feel unsafe. And she deserves compassion, not contempt. She did what she had to do. She survived. She found love, even if it was conditional love. She built a life, even if it is a life that sometimes feels like it belongs more to others than to herself. But she also deserves to know that the emergency that created her is over. That the room where she first learned to shrink is no longer the only room available to her. That she has now the capacity her younger self never had, the capacity to choose differently, not easily, not painlessly, not all at once, but differently. Let us now sit with what that building process did to her relationships, because the patterns she learned did not stay contained to childhood. They traveled with her, into every close relationship she formed, and created dynamics that have their own particular kind of loneliness. Chapter 3. The Loneliness of Always Being Needed. Chapter 3. The Loneliness of Always Being Needed. There is a kind of loneliness that is invisible from the outside. It hides inside of full social calendars and long friendships and relationships where someone is always reaching for you. It is the loneliness of the woman who is needed by many people and truly known by almost none. The woman who has become so skilled at holding others that she has never quite allowed anyone to hold her. Who has shown so many people only the managed, composed, endlessly capable version of herself that she has almost lost access to any other version, at least in the presence of another person. This loneliness is one of the deepest and most disorienting consequences of long-term people-pleasing. Because from the outside, and often from the inside too, it looks like connection. She has people in her life. She matters to them. They call her when things fall apart. They bring her their problems, their celebrations, their crises. She is the person they come to. And there is genuine warmth in that, genuine meaning. She does not want to discount it. But let us sit with what is actually happening in many of these connections. She has, over years, established herself in a particular role in each relationship. The capable one, the listener, the one who helps. And the people around her have, not maliciously but practically, organized themselves in relation to that role. They call when they need support, not always to offer it. They share their struggles in detail, without always asking about hers. They accept her composed exterior at face value, because she has never given them reason to look beneath it. They love the role even when they love her, and she has made those two things so indistinguishable that she herself can barely separate them. What she rarely allows herself, what the pattern, in fact, actively prevents, is being the one who needs. Being the one who calls because she is struggling. Being the one who arrives with her own mess, her own grief, her own inconvenient feelings. She has learned so thoroughly that need is burdensome, that vulnerability is dangerous, that the safest way to maintain closeness is to be the strong one, always. And so she holds herself together in company and falls apart in private, and tells herself that this is simply her nature, that she is not someone who leans on others, that she processes things alone, but this is not her nature. This is her wound wearing the costume of personality. And then there are the romantic relationships. The intimate partnerships where people-pleasing reaches its most complex and most damaging expression. Because in close partnership, the pattern does not just affect how she behaves, it shapes the entire architecture of the relationship. It determines who holds power and who holds it back. It determines whose needs get attended to and whose get quietly, perpetually deferred. It creates invisible contracts that were never negotiated and can never be renegotiated because they were never named. The woman who people pleases in her intimate relationship often ends up with a partner who has, however, unconsciously calibrated to her accommodation. He or she has learned that her limits are soft, that if they push a little, she will adjust, that her discomfort will not interrupt the evening, will not require a real conversation, will be smoothed over with her own effort to keep the peace. And so he continues. Not always because he is cruel. Sometimes because she has never shown him where the wall actually is. Sometimes because she has been so diligent in her performance of fineness that he genuinely does not know there is a problem, and she resents him for this. And then she resents herself for resenting him, and the resentment never gets spoken. It builds instead into a distance she cannot explain, a numbness she cannot shake, a longing for something she cannot name, some version of intimacy where she is not performing, where she does not have to manage, where she is loved not for her agreeableness, but for her actual, full, sometimes inconvenient self. There is a particular grief in recognizing that you have been in relationships, sometimes for years, sometimes for decades, and never fully arrived in them. That you have been present and absent simultaneously, present in body, in function, in warmth, absent in the precise way that matters most, in the freedom to be real. This grief does not mean the relationships were worthless. It means they were operating with less than what they could have had. And it raises a question that is both terrifying and full of possibility. What would these relationships look like if she stopped performing? If she allowed herself to be Not the composed and endlessly capable version, but the actual one. Uncertain, needy sometimes, opinionated, capable of saying no. Some relationships would not survive that, and that truth is a grief too. But some, perhaps many, would deepen in ways she cannot yet imagine. Because the people who love her for her wholeness, not just her usefulness, are waiting for her to arrive. Let us now turn inward, not to the relationships, not to the stories, but to the body, because the body has been present for all of it, and the body has been keeping very careful records. Chapter 4. What your body has been carrying. Chapter 4. What your body has been carrying. The body does not forget. This is perhaps the most important thing to understand about the long-term experience of emotional suppression. The mind can rationalize. The mind can construct narratives that make sense of things, that smooth over the edges, that decide, consciously, that something was not that bad, that you are fine, that you are over it. The body does not have this capacity. The body simply records. And it holds what it records in its tissues, its posture, its breath, its gut, its chronic tightness in places that are never quite free. Perhaps you have noticed it. A permanent, low-grade tension in the shoulders, as though you are perpetually bracing for something. A tightness in the throat that arrives when you want to speak something true and then do not speak it. A heaviness in the chest that sometimes, on the wrong kind of evening, feels not like sadness exactly, but like something heavier and older than sadness. A sensitivity in the stomach, the way it drops when someone seems displeased. The way it clenches in the moment just before a conflict that you are already preparing to dissolve. These are not random. They are the accumulated somatic record of thousands of moments in which you chose suppression over expression, in which you swallowed a no, in which you smoothed your face into composure when what it wanted to do was something else entirely, in which you moved your body into closeness with someone your nervous system was quietly, persistently signaling as unsafe. The body that lives inside a people-pleaser is a body in a chronic state of low-level vigilance. Not the acute alertness of immediate danger, but a kind of background hum of readiness. Always slightly poised. Always monitoring. Always a half-second away from adjusting its presentation based on the emotional temperature of the room. This vigilance is exhausting in a way that is almost impossible to articulate because it never fully stops. It runs continuously beneath every interaction, beneath every relationship, beneath sleep itself, which is why so many women who people please describe waking tired. Not tired from what they did, but tired from what they held. There is also something that happens to appetite, and it is not always what people expect. Sometimes the body that holds too much emotion turns to food not for hunger, but for comfort. For the brief softening of an interior that is too often rigid with control. Sometimes it goes the other way. The appetite contracts, the stomach closes. Food becomes another thing that requires too much attention in a body that is already overwhelmed. Neither of these responses is a character flaw. Both of them are the body doing its best to regulate a system that has been under strain for a very long time. And then there is the particular way the body responds to conflict, or rather, to the anticipation of conflict. For the woman who has spent years making herself small to avoid friction, the body has learned to treat even the possibility of conflict as a genuine emergency. The heart rate lifts, the breath shortens, the stomach tightens, and so she avoids, she smooths. She agrees before she has even fully registered her own disagreement. Not because she is cowardly, but because her nervous system genuinely cannot distinguish between the discomfort of a difficult conversation and the threat of abandonment, rejection, the collapse of love. It learned these as equivalent long ago, in those early rooms, and it has not yet been taught otherwise. There is something else the body carries that is perhaps harder to name. It is the weight of all the things you wanted that you did not allow yourself to want. The desires that got quietly buried because they felt like too much, too selfish, too inconvenient, too risky to voice. The version of yourself that wanted something different and chose instead to want what was easier to have approved of. The body knows about these buried wants. It holds them in its unexplained sadness, in the flat quality of certain days. in the vague and persistent feeling that there is something missing, something you cannot quite point to, but that has been absent for longer than you can remember. Acknowledging what the body carries is not an act of self-pity. It is an act of accuracy, of finally agreeing to see what is actually here, rather than what it would be more comfortable to see. And it is, strangely and quietly, the beginning of relief. Because the body that is finally seen, whose experience is finally witnessed, even just by the woman living inside it, begins, gently, to release. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in the small softening that comes when something that has been held in secrecy is finally allowed to be known. We are arriving now at something I want to offer you with great care, because what comes next is not a solution or a strategy or a list of things to do differently. What comes next is simply the beginning of a different relationship with yourself. A beginning so quiet you might not recognize it as change at first. But it is the most important change of all. Chapter 5. The beginning of Unchaining. Chapter 5. The beginning of Unchaining. The word unchaining suggests a dramatic event, a moment of decisive freedom, a single bold act in which the chains fall away and the woman emerges, finally, fully herself. That is not how it happens. That is never how it happens. The real beginning of unchaining is so quiet and so interior that it barely looks like anything at all from the outside. It looks like a woman sitting with her tea going cold while she asks herself, perhaps for the first time in years, what she actually wants from the next hour of her life. It looks like a small, private no, not spoken to anyone else, but felt for the first time as a legitimate response, rather than a failure. It looks like a moment in the middle of a conversation where she notices the impulse to apologize and simply does not follow it. These are not small things. They feel small because the culture around healing often mistakes the dramatic for the significant. But these quiet interior shifts are where actual change lives. They are the first moments in which the woman who learned to shrink begins, tentatively, to take up a different relationship with her own existence. Not louder, not more aggressive, not suddenly boundary setting in all directions, simply more honest, more present with what is actually happening inside her, and less frantically focused on what is happening for everyone else. The beginning of unchaining often starts with grief. This surprises people. They expect it to feel like relief, like liberation, and it does, eventually. But first, for most women, it feels like loss. Because to begin allowing herself to be real is also to begin acknowledging how long she has not been, how many years she spent performing, how many relationships were built around the performance rather than the reality, how much of her own life she attended as a guest rather than a participant. This grief is not a sign that something is going wrong. It is a sign that something is going right. You cannot grieve what did not matter. The grief is proof of the life that was there, underneath the shrinking, waiting all along. The beginning of unchaining also involves a renegotiation with guilt, because guilt is the primary enforcement mechanism of people-pleasing. Every time she begins to move in the direction of her own truth, to say something honest, to need something without immediately undermining that need, to take up a little more space in a conversation, guilt rises to stop her. It arrives in the voice of old authorities, the parent who needed her to be smaller, the partner who rewarded her compliance, the inner critic who learned their lesson perfectly. And it says, "Who do you think you are? You are hurting people. You are being selfish. You are not who everyone thought you were." The beginning of unchaining is learning to hear this voice, not as truth, but as history. To recognize guilt not as a reliable moral compass, but as a conditioned reflex, one that was useful once, in older rooms, and that has been running on autopilot ever since. This does not mean guilt should be ignored entirely. Sometimes it genuinely signals a misalignment worth attending to. But for the woman who has people-pleased her entire life, guilt most often signals not that she has done something wrong, but that she has done something unfamiliar, something that departs from the role. Something that puts her own reality in the room alongside everyone else's. And that is not wrong. That is the work. There is a particular tenderness required in this beginning, because the woman who is starting to unclaim herself from the role of endless accommodator is doing something she has no map for. She is feeling her way. She will make mistakes, not because she is careless, but because she is new to this territory. She will sometimes swing too far in one direction and find herself expressing something with more force than she intended, or pulling back when she meant to stay present, or reverting to the old patterns under stress because the old patterns are so deeply grooved they activate before she can catch them. None of this is failure. All of it is learning. What she needs in this beginning is not a protocol, not a set of instructions. What she needs is what she perhaps never fully received in the rooms where she first learned to shrink, the experience of being witnessed without being managed, of sitting with her own complexity without immediately trying to resolve it into something more comfortable, of being, simply, where she actually is, with as much honesty and as much compassion as she can hold for herself. This is what brings us, finally, to what lies on the other side of the unchaining. Not as a destination she must reach, but as a possibility she can begin, right now, to feel toward. Chapter 6. The size you were always meant to be. Chapter 6. The size you were always meant to be. There is a version of you that has never fully lived outside your own interior. She has been there all along, present in the moments of private clarity, in the anger you felt but did not speak, in the desire that rose up and then was pressed back down before it could become inconvenient, in the knowledge you carried quietly about what you needed and what was not good for you and what kind of life you actually wanted to live. She is not a fantasy. She is not an ideal self you must become worthy of. She is simply the actual you, the one that exists beneath the performance, beneath the accommodation, beneath the 1,000 daily acts of self-erasure that have passed for so long as generosity. What does life begin to feel like when you stop shrinking? It does not feel like constant happiness. That would be both inaccurate and unkind to promise. What it feels like in the beginning is a kind of strange lightness. The particular relief of no longer spending so much energy on managing other people's emotional experience of you, of not monitoring every sentence for how it will land, of not rehearsing conversations in advance to ensure that your actual self stays safely out of sight. There is space that opens up in the body, in the chest, in the shoulders, in the breath, that was previously occupied by vigilance. And in that space something begins, slowly, to move again. Curiosity, appetite, a reacquaintance with your own preferences, with what you actually like and do not like, quite apart from what you have learned is acceptable to like. Relationships begin to change in ways that are sometimes uncomfortable and sometimes quietly beautiful. Some relationships cannot tolerate her arrival, the full, real, occasionally inconvenient version of herself. These relationships were organized around the role, and the role's retirement disrupts them in ways that feel, at first, like confirmation of everything she feared. That being real means being alone. That the love was always conditional on her performance. This is painful. It is genuinely deeply painful. And it is also information. It is the relationship showing her clearly what it was always built on, so that she can grieve it properly and choose with open eyes what she wants to do next. But other relationships deepen in ways she never anticipated. Because when she stops performing, the people who love her for something more than her usefulness begin to see her more clearly. They meet a version of her that is more complex, more honest, less manageable, and they find that they love this version more. There is a realness in these newly honest interactions that has a different quality than anything the performance could produce. It is nourishing in a way that the praise of the agreeable version never quite was, because she knows that what is being reflected back at her now is actually her. Her relationship with her own body begins to change. The chronic vigilance that kept her tight and tired begins incrementally to soften. She sleeps differently. Not perfectly, not immediately, but differently, with a little less of the grinding busyness of a mind that is always preparing, always managing, always anticipating the next performance. She begins in very small ways to trust what her body tells her, to take the stomach drop seriously as data, to honor the tiredness as information, to listen to what rises in her before she automatically edits it into something more socially acceptable. She finds, perhaps to her surprise, that she is not less kind for having stopped shrinking. She feared this. She feared that setting her own needs down to be met alongside others would make her selfish, hard, uncaring. But kindness that comes from choice is a different quality of kindness than kindness that comes from fear. It is warmer and more sustainable and more real. When she helps now, when she gives, when she shows up for someone she loves, it is because she genuinely wants to, not because she is afraid of what will happen if she does not. And the people on the receiving end of that choice made kindness feel the difference, even if they cannot name it. She is learning, slowly and imperfectly, to take up space without apology, to finish her sentences, to hold her position in a conversation when it differs from someone else's without immediately retreating into accommodation, to want what she wants without the preemptive downgrade. She is learning, and this is perhaps the most profound part, to be a little bit boring in exactly the way that genuinely satisfied people are boring, unhurried, present, not performing for anyone, comfortable in her own skin in the ordinary, unremarkable moments of a life that belongs, finally, to her. She is learning that she was never meant to be small, that her size, her actual, full, sometimes inconvenient, sometimes magnificent size, is not a problem. It is the point. Conclusion: throughout these chapters, we have sat with something that runs very deep. We began in the rooms where the shrinking first started, where the child learned, with heartbreaking intelligence, to make herself less in order to secure love and safety. We traced the woman that learning built, the agreeable, capable, endlessly accommodating self who learned to call her performance her personality. We walked into the relationships that pattern created and sat with the particular loneliness of being needed by many and truly known by almost none. We turned to the body, the faithful, tireless keeper of every swallowed truth, every suppressed no. Every moment the real self was sent back inside to wait. And then we began the quiet work of unchaining, not in a single dramatic moment, but in the small interior shifts that are the actual architecture of change. And we allowed ourselves, gently, to imagine the size we were always meant to be. What does this mean for where you are right now? Perhaps you're at the very beginning. Perhaps you are only now, for the first time, starting to name what has been happening, starting to recognize the pattern, starting to feel the weight of it, starting to let yourself admit that it has cost you something. That is not a small thing. That recognition, however uncomfortable, is the first breath of something different. Perhaps you are somewhere in the middle. You have been doing this work for a while. You have made changes. You have lost some things and found others. And you are still, some days, reverting to the old patterns under pressure. That is not failure. That is the entirely normal, entirely human experience of rewiring something that was laid down very early and very deep. Perhaps you are on the other side of a particular threshold. You have done the grieving. You have had the difficult conversations. You have weathered the relationships that could not hold your wholeness and found yourself still here, still you. Perhaps more you than you have ever been. Wherever you are, I want you to hear this. Not as a prescription, not as a promise, but as something I believe with everything I have. You were not born to live at the edges of your own life. You were not born to take up as little space as possible, to want as little as possible, to need as little as possible, to make yourself palatable to rooms that were never comfortable with the full truth of you. You were born to inhabit your own existence completely, to have opinions and desires and limits and longings, to be in your ordinary daily life, the actual size of yourself. The unchaining is not a destination. It is a direction. And the fact that you are here, that you chose to sit with these words, that you recognized yourself in them, that something in you said, yes, this is what I have been trying to find the language for, that is already the unchaining, already in motion. If this audiobook has been a companion to you today, I want you to know that there is much more waiting for you in the Unchained Heart universe. New audiobooks are released regularly, each one written for the same woman, the one who is quietly, privately trying to understand what happened to her and find her way back. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so that you never miss one. You have carried this long enough, and you are not carrying it alone anymore. If this touched something real in you today, please follow Unchained Heart. Your presence in this community is what keeps these words finding the women who need them most. End of the audiobook.